It's your boy George Phillip, the first.
And it's Samantha Zessie Kipfly.
This is MASKulinity.
The show that investigates the performance of masculinity in the world today, and you know we spell it with a hard K.
Well, okay, that was pretty fast. You know, I thought we were doing some self-care, you know, time away, self-care, unplugged, unmiked.
Well, yeah, we did say that, but we're returning to self-care soon. But you know, with awards season underway, it's like, don't we need to talk about TV a little more?
I mean, everybody's starting to talk Oscars right now. You know, my friends at Anora are getting a lot of buzz, but I guess we can do TV too. I'm thinking SAG Awards is coming up, I believe, right?
That's right. And I don't know if you saw, but your fave is actually nominated in a few categories: outstanding performance by an ensemble in a comedy and by a male actor.
Oh, what is my fave again? I don't know what that is.
Shrinking. The shrinking into your real self.
Have I talked about shrinking? I can't remember. Was that one of my favorite shows?
Oh, yes. You had some good, poignant moments for us to reflect on, which was really actually nice. And I will be watching the show. I mean, even though a lot of times it feels rigged, like a campaign focus game, sometimes it's nice when people get the flowers that deserve. And that's great, like your face.
You know, shout out to very wealthy, smart Hollywood makers for getting all the attention they deserve and all the money that they don't need. It's fine. Flowers, sure, why not? It's okay.
Okay, points were made. Points were very much made. I mean, you know, well, did you see who else was nominated?
How would I have seen? I don't know anything about the world. I just need people to tell me. That's what you're here for, but fine.
You know what? That's fair. That's what keeps me in this well-paid job. Just kidding. Yeah, The Bear actually was nominated again.
Oh, it's lovely.
I mean, you like The Bear, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not. I mean, the consensus here, maybe not the best season, this last season of The Bear, but sure, it's good.
You know, it's a stressful ass show, but I do love it. I think Jeremy White and Ayo Adebiri really do it for me as a duo. I mean, it's the platonic trust and mixed gender leadership. That's just everything.
Is that who's nominated or other people nominated? Is Evan nominated? Fucking Evan.
Well, I know that Liza Colon-Zayas, hopefully we pronounced that correctly, is nominated, which is very dope. And I feel like there's a lot to glean about masculinity in The Bear. Wait, is that the chef?
No, that's fucking his cousin.
Richie.
Evan
Oh my God, I love
Richie.
Oh, Richie in a black suit.
I used to hang out with him. He used to shop in Brooklyn Heights. I'd see Evan all the time. Fuck you, Evan.
Really?
My name's Evan Moss-Macarack. I'm
my God.
an artist.
It's weird that what you would say is fuck you and not good job on the great show, Evan. But I do feel like there is a lot to glean about masculinity with a hard K in The Bear, along with another TV show that's actually tied it in Emmys last year. But don't worry, we're not going to talk about it alone.
Thank the Lord.
Yeah, we've got Suzanne Leonard, professor of race, gender, and sexuality studies, and the director of the Master of Arts in Gender and Cultural Studies at Simmons University, here to help us. Suzanne, welcome.
Thank you. So thrilled to be here.
Welcome, Suzanne.
So as a professor, we know that you've probably given your fair share of tests and quizzes, but let's see if you remember what it's like to be on the other side. Pop quiz, what are we talking about today?
We are going to be talking about Succession and The Bear and masculinity in both of those shows.
Nice and succinct. All right, audience, let's see if Suzanne passed the test after the break.
Curious about next-gen men? We're a small part of a much larger movement to undefine masculinity for a brighter future. Our mission is clear: empower the next generation to use their curiosity, empathy, and courage to build a more equitable world. Join the Next Gen Men community as we learn and unlearn together. We're here to support boys and men to break free from limiting stereotypes. We're not just an organization, we're a catalyst for reimagining masculinity and fostering inclusivity. We're here to help open up possibilities for what men and boys can be. Explore the world of Next Gen Men at nextgenmen.ca and join the community to make a difference. Next Gen Men, shaping tomorrow's leaders one step at a time. Join us and help undefine masculinity and empower the next generation of men to lead with empathy and courage.
Welcome back. So we're here the week of the SAG Awards, and a couple of the nominees have been catching our eye in terms of masculinity.
Yeah, I think we talked about Shrinking recently and how it's this beautiful ensemble of intergenerational, multicultural people having open conversations, men being so vulnerable and kind and supportive and loving of everybody. It's great. I love that show.
Yeah, and one of these shows are, which is also nominated for Outstanding Ensemble, brings a lot of masculinity with a hard K and dealing with mental health. But before we get there, I wanted to talk about another show that received this very same accolade last year. So do we have any guesses on what show that might be?
No clue. I don't know. I don't pay attention to awards. Ugh, whatever. That's your job. I don't know.
Ramoy's a literati. That's what's going on. Anyways, what about you, Suzanne? What do you think we're talking about today?
Am I allowed to give it away?
Well, let me give you a hint. The show unites a few themes that we've discussed on the show, like workplace, family, media, and leadership. And it's also about a tycoon family. It's an HBO show.
Our current reality? I don't know.
I know, seriously. In a very scary way.
Oh my God.
I think we're going to the very Shakespearean Succession.
Yes. Good job. You guessed it. I mean, you might have known before, but yeah. So audience, if you got this right, buy yourself a fancy snack, something that Samantha would like. So how much do you guys know about this show? I'm going to start with you, Ramoy.
Oh, people love it. It's about rich people being miserable, rich white people being miserable, and I just have no space for it. But that's fine. Whatever. Go for it. That's what I know. Literally the extent of it. Oh, and there's Kieran Culkin doing Kieran Culkin things, and Brian Cox doing Brian Cox things. Great. Whatever. Yes. Fine. People laugh. Whatever.
It's like Jeremy Strong doing Jeremy Strong things. Because, my man is thespianing, okay?
Yeah. Oh, I'm such a repressed actor, method actor. Bleh, I'm Jeremy Strong. Bleh.
I love him. He's so dramatic.
Very serious, guys. He's so serious. He's about his craft, right?
So intense. So, well, Suzanne, you sound like you've watched the show.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you know about it? Can you tell us about it a little bit?
Yeah, I've watched actually every episode. So I will say just a couple things. That one thing is I love the mise en scène, in part because though these rich people are disgusting, I love being on yachts with them and being in fancy penthouses with them. And there's just something, I mean, it's so voyeuristic, right, in that way, but just and they're filming on location, right? When they just go places I'll never go, on private jets that I'll never be in, right? So there's a little bit of that, and of course, I know this is completely intentional, but you're oh my God, these people are in the most beautiful, sublime places on the earth, and they're so miserable, right? And of course, that's the Schadenfreude or whatever that term is, right? When you take pleasure in other people's misery, where you're kind of oh, they're so rich, but they're so troubled. They're so, they're so fraught and angry and grief-stricken and pain and in so much pain. So yeah, I have to say, I loved the show.
I love that you ended up that, and then we're and I loved it. It's great. Yeah, I have to say, if I were on yachts with warm colored lighting everywhere, wearing Prada sunglasses, I just don't think I'd be that sad. I just feel I would just be it would be a perpetual vacation, and I feel I'm always happy when I'm on vacation. But I don't know, naivete. So everything you guys said is right. For some background audience, the show chronicles the power struggle between a media tycoon dad and his kids for the head seat at the media conglomerate that he essentially created, right? So the series is essentially the kids trying to wrestle Waystar Royco out of their dad's hands.
But that Waystar Royco, that's the company, I guess? Is that the name of the company?
Yeah, it's the name of the company, which feels very... It's so, anyway, whatever. So Logan Roy, who's played by Brian Cox, plays his kids against each other as he continues to stay in charge, even as he has health scares and gets more and more out of touch with both the company and the society around it.
Yeah. we wanted to talk about this because why?
I know it's your jam. No. Well, there's so many themes here, right? Like, this time we've got an ensemble that upholds the mask. It's the whole ensemble upholding the mask, right? So everyone, regardless of their gender, perpetuates this power dynamic in the struggle for power. And as BBC Culture senior journalist Hugh Montgomery put it, he had an article titled HBO Succession in Our Reckoning with Male Monsters. He said, quote, "It feels part of a reckoning with the particular strain of rich white men who continue to have a grip on the Western political and media establishment and have arguably or very clearly abused that power to monstrous effect."
Yeah, I mean, I guess that feels very prescient now, considering. No?
Yeah. I mean, Suzanne, do you agree? Do you feel like that's why we should be talking about it? That's kind of why I think so, among other things. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One is, I mean, to Ramoy's point about the prescience of this. I mean, obviously, we're seeing Musk suddenly like in charge of, I don't know, everything, I guess. And, you know, the Waystar, what is it? Waystar?
Royco.
Right. It's like loosely based on Fox News. Right. And
yes.
so it's basically chronicling the kind of disintegration of traditional media formats. Right. Like, so, you know, and the fact that people are not getting their news anymore from like a single journalistic source, you know, even something like Fox News, right? Like now there's Breitbart, like, cause there's all these like, you know, even even right wing places that exist, right? So at one hand, I was serious when I talked about the sort of Shakespearean nature of it all, right? It's about kind of like the king and who's going to kind of succeed the king, you know, Logan Roy. But also, I think this question of sort of what do we do with like a changing media ecology, right? That we're sort of living in, and then who are like the winners and the losers in this kind of new epoch or something. And I think what's so weird, of course, what we're seeing right now in the current political landscape is turns out the winners once again are all the white men, right?
Like, what?
Yeah. And I think when Succession was on, there was this notion that, this was dying out. Right. Like, as we know, Logan Roy dies in the, you know, about like the second or the third episode of the final season. And, you know, there's a moment where sort of one of the kids is like, well, I just never thought he would die. Right. Like he was such like a scion, right, of industry, and also just the way he treated his family. And I think, you know, frankly, when Succession was being filmed, we were in a moment where we thought, okay, this is the end, right? This is the end of an era of these sort of powerful white men who get to control everything. And so the show, I think, was mourning, oddly enough, like mourning too early, as it seems, right? Like,
yes.
The fact that this was an era that was passing, and of course, as we were just saying, it has not passed at all.
Yeah. And I feel like, actually, you made a good point about this yesterday for Moy when we were talking about this, which was that, like, I feel like you were like, was it worth it or something like that about having the show, like the show being in existence, you know, like. Yeah,
like I just, sometimes I get frustrated with shows like these because it's easy to like, I understand that it can be an escape tool to like have some comedy or some brevity at the expense of like shitty white people, rich white people, elitist capitalist white people. But instead of utilizing that what that can end up doing is it can soften like our understanding of the reality that's at hand, and or set some expectations, kind of like what Suzanne mentioned of like, oh, we're expecting, you know, dying out and this is over, when in reality the individuals who are still utilizing some of the tactics that these fictionalized characters use are doing that very successfully. And it kind of creates a slippage in like reality from fiction, if that makes sense. So
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like, you know, one thing, so to kind of provide more context of this, right? Like you said this already, Suzanne, about this, you said this already, Suzanne, but yeah, this is based on Rupert Murdoch and his family, right? And like, while there are differences between Logan Roy and Rupert Murdoch and, you know, Waystar Royco and Fox News, you know, they're similar enough that Murdoch's ex-wife, Jerry Hall, was actually forbidden from giving Succession writers ideas for the show as part of her divorce settlement from Rupert Murdoch, right? So like...
Yeah, but it's like Murdoch, sure it's Fox News, but it's also like other media, news, print, right? If I remember correctly.
Exactly. Right. Like he owns the parent companies, News Corp and Fox corporations, which have outlets in Australia, where he's originally from, the US and the UK. So besides Fox News, his outlets are also like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and the publishing company HarperCollins, which I did not know until I was researching for this show.
It's not surprising, but it still is. But not surprising is like the conservative news elements that a lot of people are consuming in this moment. It's all run by him.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, Vermoy, I think you're making such a smart point about we take pleasure in this, this kind of the shitty white people, if I can say that, like, right. But I'm thinking too that appetite doesn't seem to have abated, but I'd be very curious. I know we're not talking about the show, but something like The White Lotus, where, right?
You can come back and we could definitely talk about that.
Oh my God.
I am here for
it. I know. But this notion of like, it basically, again, following super rich people in these really elite spaces, and I guess I'm just wondering, and this is where, whatever, 2 to 3 weeks into the Trump presidency, I just threw up a little as I said that, will this cease to be entertaining? Because I'm not sure, you know what I mean? I think, I'm just trying to think when Succession started. I feel like what we used to take as entertaining because it wasn't reality has so painfully and blatantly become the reality that I'm not sure how entertaining this would be to watch now, right? For that exact reason.
It's a good thought experiment. Like, the environment has shifted so much. Like, would this be more, would this even, depending on like the population that actually entertained it, would it shift? And also would it be entertained more as a tragedy versus a comedy, right?
I think that's a good point because remember towards you probably don't know this for where, but at the very end, the family sort of helps to elect a Trump-ish figure, right? They there's all kind of, it's a side plot, right? But essentially they get somebody back in power who's a complete like megalomaniac.
Well, so it's a great, well, not great, but like basically this really is mirroring reality, right? Because like, Rupert Murdoch and his son Lachlan, it's based on them, but it's also kind of based on other kind of media conglomerates. Like our friend Hugh Montgomery, hopefully at some point we'll get to have him on the show because he put on the really nice analysis about this. Is like, he's pretty clear that the Murdochs are, quote, hardly unique in their combination of excessive influence and nepotistic dysfunction. And the Roys bear the influence of numerous clans from the Maxwells to, of course, the Trumps, so like, I think I don't know if it's going to cease to be entertaining to some people, because I do think that the level of disinformation that we've encountered in this country is such that like, people like struggle to know what the truth is. And they struggle to know like what is really going on. So, I mean, I don't know. I do feel like this hardcore resemblance to reality is something that unfortunately might be lost on a lot of people.
All this, okay, we're having a great conversation. I get it. It's complicated. The world is complicated right now. That's not even the fair adjective, but whatever. Why is this show? Why are we talking about it? Why is it important and or relevant?
Well, so I have a theory and I'm going to present it to you guys. I feel like there are these narratives of how people should act and be based on top-down traditional tropes, right? Including gender. So the outlets owned by the Murdochs have been kind of instrumental in peddling that messaging, right? Like things like having Josh Hawley on to discuss the importance of masculinity in society, or actually, to your point, Suzanne, Fox Corp being so significant in promoting the message that Biden stole the election in 2020 that they had to settle a lawsuit of over like $780 million, which for them is actually kind of a drop in the bucket, maybe not a drop in the bucket. It's a pretty large bucket, but still, Yeah,
I mean, it's all wild to say the least, but like liberal media is biased too. Like there's always going to be media bias, no?
I mean, I agree. I think it's true that bias is unfortunately everywhere when it comes to news. When it comes to traditional masculinity, though, while liberal media has at least pretended to evolve, right? Maybe not pretended to evolve, let me not say that, but it's sort of evolved to be more inclusive, albeit with its own issues. We did see, as conservative media stuck to its conservative messaging, particularly Fox News, and how it's yielded big results for them.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, this goes a little bit against the point that I was making earlier, but it seemed to me that Succession was so into sort of plumbing the depths of, what you call kind of masculinity, right? Kind of plumbing the depths of like the complete dysfunction, right? Like that is hidden underneath this kind of like bravado and swagger and, just the grief, right? And I think I'm so excited we're going to talk about The Bear because I've been thinking about that show, particularly being that it's still on, like how that show is so much about grief and pain and loss. And I think, essentially Succession, it too is this sort of elegy for like this idea of like what a man should have been, right? And again, and what was successful, right, for so long, which was kind of the Logan Roy kind of take no prisoners, completely heartless, ruthless, right? Ruthlessness. And you see these sort of broken men in his wake, right? Like both Kendall and Roman, who are just utterly, I mean, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, they're broken people. Right? They're just utterly inept, incompetent. And I mean, that just biting thing, I think that Logan says to all of his children towards the end of his life, where he's like, you're not serious people. Right?
Oh my God.
Oh, and it's
oh my God.
cutting, right? It is just so cutting. So I as I said, as much as I think the show is, essentially like was elegizing something that has not gone or it's not over in any way, shape, or form, but it does talk, I think, in really smart ways about how this type of masculinity or the performance of this type of masculinity or the execution of this type of masculinity utterly breaks people, right? And I think that's what of course, we're living through this now, but I mean, again, I don't want to like psychologist Trump because I try to think about him, more than I utterly have to or Musk. But I mean, like something is very broken about these men, right? And there's something very broken about all of these men, right? Like the RFK, right? The one that they're going to appoint to the human, whatever, the health services. We are basically now being ruled by legions of very broken men, right? I would put Vance in that category too. And it's hard to see that brokenness because they wield so much power. And I think, just to conclude this thought, I think what was interesting about Succession is that you were able to see the power being wielded and how broken they were. Yeah. And I think that was in some ways the genius of the show. Right. So they were showing us something that we can't see now, but I know is there, right, about our sort of current administration.
Yeah, there's like that closed door effect that the show allowed you to peek behind and get to see, which I didn't get to see, but I hear was complex. And as we're discussing, seems more and more interesting. But still, we were lucky we got to talk to, or Samantha was lucky, she got to talk to Pew Research Center a couple of times, and they sent over some of their early reporting on some of this, the mixing of gender and Americans' gender and politics. And, they confirmed before the election that American conservatives are leaning towards like thinking that this country does not appreciate traditional masculinity enough. Which, is kind of related to some of this messaging.
Yeah. And I feel like, what I'm interested in is like, you really talked a lot about this, Suzanne, is like these patriarchs that run these billion-dollar family empires, like so many people want to emulate them, right? Like people gave Trump credit for being a great businessman, for being a married man, for speaking his mind.
Idiot. That's fine. Whatever.
It's like baffling. In a way, to see how people believe Trump, no matter how untrue the things he says are, you know, he's checking boxes like on a surface, but him having kids does not make him a family man. Him having a business does not make him a good businessman. And him being unafraid to boldly say whatever comes to mind doesn't necessarily make him brave, right? But all of these things were enough to convince people that he should be president because he has this kind of like...
I heard this really interesting thing. It was before the election, before we knew the outcome. And they made this, I thought, really smart point that essentially people... had like basically they got an idea of Trump like in 2015, let's say, that he was a good businessman and he was going to run the country like a business and it was going to be better, right? And nothing he does could change that. And it was really interesting. And it was sort of about, I mean, they didn't call it sort of the power of masculinity, but frankly, the power of white masculinity to be known as one thing. And once they're known as one thing, no one that's like unshakable somehow, right? Because as you said, he's a terrible businessman, right? And he's a bully and he's cruel, right? But that it was initially framed as him speaking his mind, to your point, being brave, being a good businessman. And I think it was that image, right? It was that image of strength and power and that whole, I mean, remember the speech he gave when he was inaugurated in 2016? Like, I alone can fix it. Right. And of course, he didn't fix anything and he's not fixing anything now. Obviously, he's breaking it. Right. He's breaking and breaking and breaking.
Yes.
But that is, again, frankly, the power of white, rich men. People believe what they say.
Yo, talk about it. Like, it's like... It's this weird, it's what I wish we're going to get more into, right? Like, I mean, he does represent this masculinity that people want to see leading them, right? This like all powerful patriarch that is unquestioned. So it seems worth it to examine what's going on behind closed doors at the risk of like, I don't know, creating more succession type fodder of like examining rich white men who like, you know, fuck up our lives. But anyway, so let's just do it. So audience, there have already been some spoilers. There will be more spoilers. The show starts out with Logan Roy being played by Brian Cox, about to pass the company to his son, Kendall, who is played by thespian method actor, serious man, Jeremy Strong. So Logan then changes his mind without telling Kendall. And so here is the clip of the first time they speak after Kendall finds out.
You fucked me.
I changed my mind, Kendall.
When? When exactly? Because it feels like you fucked me.
It's me. It's mainly me. But you, 3 years ago, you were still in the nut house.
Rehab. Dad, it's called rehab. And I'm in recovery.
It's all good. I'm just concerned you might be soft as yet.
Soft? Are you kidding? I did a fucking year in Shanghai.
I hear you let the guy from the website trash talk you, and you just let him come.
It's not a website. And I was being professional.
I hear it played weak, conflict averse.
I wasn't about to get into a fucking big dick competition, okay?
I hear you bent for him.
What?
I hear you bent for him, and he fucked you.
Well, no, actually.
You know, I know that you've read a lot of books about business management and this and that, but you know what?
What?
Sometimes it is a big dick competition.
All right, so what is your reaction to this clip?
Wow. I mean, obviously, I haven't seen it in a long time. The messaging of him calling Kendall soft and weak, and basically, I mean, it is like, it couldn't be more obvious, right? Like where he's sort of like, sometimes it is about having a big dick. I mean, it is just this like elucidation of, again, what seems like it should be a joke, right? Because it is so hyperbolic, right? It is such a hyperbolic expression of masculinity, or like what it should be. And then obviously Kendall is being sort of raked over the coals for not exhibiting that type of behavior.
What about you, Ramor?
You know, sometimes our world, America, our society makes it seem like shitty if you don't have a dad. This sounds great not having a dad because I don't want to go through that shit. Huh? Like that take, like that joke? No?
It's also rough. Yes. Also a rough response.
No, like the generational aspect of it is interesting. The dad, son, hyper-masculinity, yada, 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 you know?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one thing that rewatching this clip, I've watched it a few times, but the thing that it's like it's about having the bigger dick. It's like you are comparing your dick to your son's right now. Like, is that really what you're doing? Like, that's really what you're gonna do, right? And so it's like this weird piece of like, you can be this billionaire who has done so much and achieved so much and is, revered and like has, there's so many different people who, fear Logan Roy, but your masculinity could still at some point be taken away from you by some random person that you imagine goes around emasculating people. And it's like this weird tension between old school and new school in a way, like you're saying, Ramoy. Like, I feel like Kendall at this point, I mean, this is episode 1, season 1, right? So it's perceived that Kendall has done a lot of work to clean up his act and be a responsible man in life and his business. He's proven himself at the company enough that like, Logan was supposedly going to have him take over, but, with somewhat of a more evolved approach. But now he's hearing that he needs to turn up the toxic. So, like, it feels like this turning up the toxic narrative is somewhat familiar. Does it feel familiar to you guys? It feels familiar to me.
I love that phrase, the turning up the toxic, right? And I had forgotten, this particular scene, obviously, but the way in which essentially this sets off the entire kind of the entire landscape, right, of like what happens to Kendall, right, where he's trying for like 4 seasons, supposedly over, multiple years to like show that he is a big dick, right? Like metaphorically, right? Like that, just watching him being like, look, I just was trying to be professional, right? Like, he's defending himself, but he's so, he's just being berated and this reminds me, essentially, like I said, he just spends the entire rest of the seasons that we see him constantly trying to prove himself in this, to turn up the toxic, to use your really smart wording, Samantha.
Well, I mean, I think he does do exactly that, as you're saying. And what that involves is like him falling back into his old ways, right? Like we heard him say something about, like him working on, like he went to rehab, working on getting out of his addiction. And this next scene comes after the whole family has gone to therapy together. Kendall is currently suing Logan and did not go to therapy with the family. And basically Kendall walks into their retreat house at the end of this therapy day. So
your dreams have come true. Congratulations.
Hey, just so you know, I think things are good with the launch. I talked to the guy.
He doesn't care, Rom. He doesn't even fucking notice. Dad, give him a high five. Come on, he's waiting. Dad?
You do that to me. Eves, I'm one Senate member who wants to fuck me ragged. On the same side as those animals that hit me with a bag of piss.
It's my work, Dad. You of all people don't understand
work?
that.
It's rebellion. Sabotage.
Oh, yeah, of course, because it's all about you. Yeah, not that I might be in agreement with his points about the purchases, or just maybe his whole philosophy.
Philosophy? This is nothing but a miserable, deliberate attempt to undermine my whole business strategy.
You don't have a business strategy, Dad. Your whole business model is based on seducing presidents. You're a really high-class hooker. No offense.
Hey.
Fuck off. It's fine. Yeah, my handsome addict. It's been a long day. It's been really nice getting to know you all a bit better.
Night.
Night.
I've got to say, I feel a little bit used today, Pa.
Oh, for fuck's sake, not you too.
Where we are and all that's happened, and then even tonight you have to go off and work?
I made some calls. Jesus, can't you wait?
Can I wait for you to finish a few calls? Yeah, I think so. I think so, Pa. I've had a bit of practice.
Connor.
Quite a bit.
Connor, your father has been busy dealing with these 2 traitors.
Disagreeing with Dad is not treason.
But trying to make one of his biggest enemies president is kind of a fuck you.
Oh, hey, Dad. Dad, I like those stories you planted about me. That was...
Yeah, you forced my hand.
There it is.
Yes, and he's fucking lucky that was all. What you kids do not understand, it's all part of the game.
All right, so there's a lot going on in the scene. What do we hear?
I mean, a couple things. One is this notion that, I'm sorry, I hate to keep talking about Trump.
Well,
but
no,
like,
I mean, it makes
this, this notion that anybody who betrays him or doesn't have pledge utter loyalty and fealty to him is undermining his business strategy, right? And then the way this ending where he tries to say to Kendall, "You are a nobody," right? And then again, because I'm a feminist media scholar. I love being on this podcast to talk about men, but usually like I'm talking about women. And so like what he does to Shiv, what Logan does to Shiv in that way of just kind of like basically demeaning her marriage and her, and the fact that she's working for kind of a rival of his, because she was in politics for the first season or two before she basically decides she too wants to take over the family business. Just the way, I guess, the way the stakes are so high for this family, like the stakes are so high for their interpersonal relationships and the stakes are so high for the business, right? We're talking about like billions of dollars. We're talking about the presidential election and we're talking about like just this family, right? And so I think another thing that the show is really smart about somehow is basically making those things all apace, right? Like that who gets elected president and who controls, one of the major, news conglomerates in the nation is all really connected to this kind of dysfunctional family drama, right? And to make those two things, like I said, intertwine those two in a way that like one depends on the other, right? Like one cannot succeed without the other, and the dysfunctionality of one is completely mirrored in the other. And I think the stakes are so high, not just for these like, 6 rich people, right? And I think that's why in some ways we're kind of like, all right, why are we going to spend why are we going to spend time with these people and their dysfunction? But I think to not understand that is to essentially not understand the way power functions in our society. And I think for those of us who care about how power functions in our society and care deeply about it, trying to figure out and change how power functions in society means understanding it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say quickly that, in our first TV series episode, we talked about dads and how they negotiate this tension between humanity and masculinity with a hard K, right? And it's all based on these invisible rules that they can't help but break because of their humanity. And this is sort of looking at someone, in Logan Roy, who could be viewed as the one who's actually enforcing the rules of their masculinity as a cultural authority, right? He's like setting the standard for what that is. And then those standards are then used to police people's masculinity.
And to, like I was saying too, wield real power. Like we're just not talking about a fictional character here, right? Like we're talking about, frankly, like real men who are in power today, right? Issuing executive orders or closing down governments or, literally laying off, like threatening to deport people, like real people, like laying off hordes, trying to close the Department of Education, right? So like, this is not just a metaphorical concept we're talking about, right? This is about wielding power that has real life impacts on everyone in this nation, I would argue.
Yeah, it also reinforces like another story that I'm very interested in, and I kind of made a bit about it earlier, but like it reinforces this father figure, right? So clearly, and this leader figure, this patriarch, right? Whether that's, innate to our society or just a very deeply embedded story that we've come to participate in and subscribe to. The characters in this show are playing with that and help reinforce that. And unfortunately, we also see it in our reality very much.
Yes, like this 100% all-powerful patriarch that gets to decide for everyone, both in family and in business, what's best, including what media and information folks to consume. And like, he'll sabotage his son for that power, right? For that followership, for those followers. And we'll let him, right? But what's interesting, and you obviously made the point about Shiv, right? He'll completely sabotage his son. It's easy how he would to see how someone like that, you know, in Rupert Murdoch might disinform us as the public, right? But then that same person can't see why, you know, his daughter might have a mind of his own and be against his own values, even though you're literally willingly against your own children. So we're going to go ahead and listen to a final Succession clip. And for this one, it's going to be toward the end of the series. Logan is at a diner, and this scene unfolds as he is sitting across from his head of security. And this will give us some insight as to how he actually feels.
What are people? They're economic units. I'm 100 feet tall. These people are pygmies. But together, form a market.
Okay, right.
What is a person? It has values and aims, but it operates in a market. Marriage market, job market, money market, market for ideas, etc., etc.
Uh-huh. So everything is a market?
Everything I try to do, people turn against me. Nothing tastes like it used to, does it? Nothing's the same as it was. Do you think there's anything after all this? Afterwards?
I don't know.
I don't think so. I think this is it, right?
Maybe. My dad is very religious,
Yeah,
but
realistically, though,
I don't know.
That's it.
All right, so what do we hear?
I mean, first of all, obviously, you know, in academic terms, we would call this neoliberalism, right? Everything is market. It's all about optimizing, right? There's people are economic units, right? And sort of everything is to be commodified, optimized, and, you know, essentially extracted, right? Like people's labor is extracted, their emotions are extracted for the benefit of the powerful, right? And so I think Logan's voicing of that is key, right? But then he goes to this it's fascinating nostalgia. Nothing is the same as it was. Right. And I think that notion of nothing is the same as it was, I mean, you know, frankly, you know, conservative politics has been playing on that. I'm sure someone did it before Reagan, but remember Reagan, you know, sort of like this invocation of the 1950s, which, as we know, benefited, you know, white people again. But this notion, and I mean, to be completely frank, I find myself slipping into this too. Like, products aren't made the way they were, like, before cell phones, you know, like this kind of this feeling of like things were simpler then. Like, we understood things then that we cannot understand now, right? Which then somehow takes him into death and what happens after death. So there's three moves in this conversation. There's people are economic units, nostalgia for the past, and then a sense of all right, we can't go back to the past, but then what happens in the future? Well, in the future, we're all going to die, and we all don't know what's going to happen after, right? So I think if all we have now is people, and people are just economic units, we're stuck in this sort of eternal present of marketization, right? It's never going to be the way it was before, and we basically think nothing comes after. So people have talked about his nihilism, but I mean, this seems to me like such an invocation of that utter kind of nihilism, right? Which is the nihilism that is kind of late stage capitalism, right?
Yeah, it's it's interesting watching a character of this capacity, meaning again, like we've mentioned, sure, old, wealthy, absurdly wealthy capitalist white man aging and being able to objectify individuals as units in the market and then also still hold himself like with some level of humanity with this nostalgia. But it's all just playing into these American tropes of modern Americana in such fascinating ways. But then, so we look at all those, but then we still can't not see that it's, again, old white man holding the boundaries of all these narratives that are these Russian nesting dolls living within each other. And if we could lose sight of the fact that, like, outside of this trope holding this nesting doll holding these other nesting dolls, right, that there are actually space with outside that. And the space outside that is where a majority of us, especially those who aren't rich white males, exist and are trying to find our wholeness in our existence, right? And I think that's what's the challenge of a lot of things of patriarchy, right? It's so the boundaries of it are so rigid and seem to hold so much of our existence, but in reality, it's just the confines of those narratives and those stories that we kind of see all the time that hold us, when in reality, the lives that we do live exceed outside of those boundaries. And we just have to kind of, our vision, our scope has to like kind of be shook a little bit to remember that. I think the show, if we can see it right, can do that. We just got to be allowed to be shook a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, he thinks of himself as God. So it's like, you know, I'm a giant. These are people, pygmies. It's all happening in this lifetime for him. So he must be all powerful within this lifetime for him. And he has set himself up economically and culturally such that it is really hard to be able to see outside of those nesting dolls, right? Like being able to shake that up, as you're saying, Ramoy, is very difficult because they've come, like, in a lot of ways, you know, the Murdochs, the Maxwells and stuff commandeered a lot of the way that at least conservative people are receiving their information. And so it's like, you know, to be able to like move beyond that, see beyond that has been difficult. I mean, you saw with what happened with the election and stuff, like the campaign of disinformation, the manosphere being involved, connecting with the, you know, connecting with men, really, and, you know, kind of creating this narrative around this person who is all powerful that must be followed, because then you get somehow like you're rubbing elbows with the all powerful, and somehow that makes you a little bit more powerful than you were. But no, you are a unit. You are a unit in his big capitalist chess game, and that's it. Anyway, well, we've been at this for a while, so. Really great conversation about Succession. Let's go ahead and take a little break and come right back.
I actually found out later by a friend that Matthew tried to kill himself after that.
What does it look like to go from a perpetrator of violence to an undaunted ally for those who are vulnerable?
So, I mean, that made me feel really guilty, and I couldn't eat anything, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't do anything. I mean, I thought I deserved what he got. That's when I started talking to you.
This is the story of Lewis, a 12-year-old who went through a remarkable transformation to become the young man he is today. It's also one of the most powerful things I've ever recorded as part of Breaking the Boy Code, a podcast centered on the inner lives of boys and what it looks like for parents and educators to raise the next generation of men. Created in collaboration with Next Gen Men Podcast Network, listen to Breaking the Boy Code podcast wherever you get podcasts.
All right, we're back. So, Ramon, are you going to watch Succession now? Like, are you interested at all?
Absolutely not. Good try.
You?
I appreciate both of you for trying, but absolutely not.
I mean, I don't know. I didn't think that this was going to turn you around, you know, but thanks for listening. Okay, so now for our nominee.
And it's a show I would actually watch and have watched.
Yes. So Suzanne, do you watch The Bear? I feel like you mentioned you did.
I do. Yeah. And I'm really excited to talk about it.
Good. So we've all watched it, and I thought we might have a discussion about some of the themes that come up, right? So, you know, Ramoy, can you give the audience a synopsis about the show?
Sure, no pressure. Okay. Yeah. So let's see. Linearly, how does? Okay. So The Bear, the titular character of the show is actually a restaurant. It's like a hot dog sausage joint in like downtown Chicago, real working class, real construction guy, real Ramoy walks in and gets a vegan sausage dog. Not a vegan sausage dog, but whatever. It's you know, it's in a place of disrepair and kind of not functioning and owes a lot of tax dollars and owes people money. Anyways, a young man comes through at some point. His name is Carmy. He is the younger brother of the individual who owned the bear, and he's trying to save the shop. His older brother, who initially owned the bear, the sausage shop, we'll come to learn throughout the series, killed himself for reasons we're not completely sure of, but stress and trauma from the past in this kind of working class family and life and society. He had his struggles. So Carmy comes in to try to save the restaurant and brings on a new cast of characters and clowns to run it. But Carmy also comes from an experience of he, at a young age, went into the fine dining world and studied to be a chef. So he brings like this, not only does he bring like the family kind of pedigree of running this restaurant, he brings with him kind of like this drive, this ambition to kind of revitalize this restaurant and hold it to like this food class and caliber that the restaurant has not experienced before. And he starts shifting it to be more of a fine dining establishment. So over now the 3 seasons we're in, we're following this growth and evolution of the bear, but really through the eyes of Carmy and all the other subsequent characters from his cast and kitchen that he's hired to turn it from this kind of just corner hot dog spot to be this fine dining, like sit down, prefix kind of establishment and what that looks like. And it's beautiful, and there's like food and words that we all don't know what they mean, but we nod our heads like we do. There's like flowers and vases and yes, chef. We've all been saying yes, chef, and heard now.
Yes.
So that's my long-winded synopsis.
The yes, chef situation was real. Like if people were saying yes, chef at all points, I'm going to try to see if I can bring that back single-handedly. But anyway, so a big thing, like great synopsis. Thank you. As you can tell, audience, I mean, if you have not watched The Bear, there's a lot going on in this show, right? There's a lot of things that like characters have to like manage, that the writers have to figure out how to like work through. So we're going to get into it. I feel like one of the big themes, or a couple of the big themes that come up that are interlinked in this show are mental health and grief, right? Like, you know, we've obviously talked about Ramoy's fave, Shrinking, another nominee, which in many ways depicts like the healthiest ways to deal with mental troubles. Still dealing with humans, kind of having a hard time dealing with that, but the way to manage it, right, is like kind of a really healthy way to do it with all these therapists. And here we're dealing with mental health and grief in this highly stressful occupation. The show starts out with the worst outcome for mental health, really, you know, his brother dying by suicide. So Ramoy, you live in New York City. I used to live in New York. Well, shout out to Brooklyn. So it's tough to be a chef in a big city. Like that's something that has been talked about in terms of chefs' mental health and that stress level, right? So off top, how would you say that The Bear deals with mental health or deals with grief? And grief.
I think it's doing a good job of kind of balancing two ideals. Like if we were going to say like the Succession and the Shrinking are the two sides of the spectrum, right?
Yes,
then
perfect.
It's somewhere like classily, very delicately in the middle of that. Because again, it is like a working class shop and it's Chicago and these are tough guys, a lot of the characters. Not Mikey Madison. What's his name?
You talking about Richie?
No. Oh, no. Not Mikey Madison. What is his name? The real chef. Funniest guy ever now. Never mind. Don't worry about it. Anyway, working class. It's somewhere in the middle. And the way that Carmy is and like some of the characters are, they are very sensitive and caring. And they do show real beautiful ways of like support and loving, and or at times they actually apologize, and they may be gruff at times or over the top, but because of the traumas they've experienced in the past, or that they are comfortable with learning and growing, they'll adapt and they'll change their ways, and they'll stay accountable to themselves in really beautiful ways. And it doesn't get too over therapized like maybe Shrinking can show, or in ways that may be too extreme for others to like really engage with. It's somewhere in the middle, which I think is special and interesting. It's not afraid of showing like the toxicity of like restaurant culture or what it means to grow up in trauma and how that may affect you in your present day, even if it seems out of your control. But it also isn't afraid to show like ways of like healing and navigating through that, which may be messy, but is still positive, like forward.
I love the messiness of the bear, like I really, those moments when like Carmi is like in like the opening night of this restaurant that he's been working on for so long and he gets stuck in the freezer. I mean, oh man, I was devastated for him, and then at the same time, Sid got to shine, right? Which we'll get to in a second. So, of course, we talked about like the stereotype and real lived experience really of, chefs having to get through long hours and stress and sometimes having to indulge in things to keep them up. And there are similarities in some ways between Kendall and Carmi, right? Like they both got big shoes to fill. They're taking up the mantle for the men in their family. Of course, Carmi's brother seemed like this kind of guy that everybody loved, rightfully so. He had his issues as a human. But he was generally a loving guy. Now, on the other hand of that, you've got like to follow in the shoes of Logan, who is like, inching towards like dementia, but is still trying to wrestle and keep the company in his hands. And so it's like, I wonder what you guys notice about the way that the bear handles that type of stress compared to Succession. And I'll turn to you, Suzanne, here, because I know that, you haven't watched Succession or more.
I think it's interesting when you thinking about sort of Mikey, who is kind of this like absent presence, right? And he does appear a few times, particularly in the Fishes episode, which I think is just like an astounding piece of television, or where you really start to see sort of some of his issues. And I think we need to say there's a strong suggestion that Mikey has addiction issues, right? And it's not entirely clear what he was addicted to, but and he was also, I think, in the hole, essentially, the place, which was, I think, called the Original Beef before Carmi turns it into the bear. That place is like literally falling apart, right? And they're like, sort of patching the walls with like duct tape, et cetera. But so you have essentially these two, like the relationship between those brothers, I think is really important to the show. And you see kind of Carmi, who inherits this restaurant that Mikey never really let him work in, right? And, like Mikey, it basically, during the Fishes episode, which I happened to just watch yesterday, so it's like very much in my mind, but basically Carmi like shows, he has this like picture drawn up of like the bear, right? The restaurant that he then opens after Mikey's death. And he gives it to Mikey and is like, I want to do this. Like, I want to open a restaurant with you, right? And so what Mikey essentially does is deny Carmi the opportunity to like work together, right? And he, and Carmi, basically, I think it's just dealing with like such isolation from his family. And then, the show obviously is about him sort of like coming back, like coming home, coming back to Chicago, coming back to the Original Beef, then trying to kind of make it more into his vision, which is obviously like this kind of high-end restaurant. So I think, unlike the Logan Roy situation where you have this like, toxic, berating, presence, I think with Mikey, there's just, the show is kind of overlaid with this sense of not only loss and grief, but the things you can never say, right? Like when in the first season, Carmi finds the note, right? The like, let it rip, I think it is that, right? Which was like the thing that we find out, I think, before that Mikey always used to say to Carmi, like, come on, like, you can do this, right? And so, I think that show has so much to do with like the unspoken, right? The things, as I said, that were never said. And even then, like, essentially this, what is kind of the suicide note, if you want to call it that, is just sort of like, saying like, all right, like, you've got this now, right? Like, and then also like the money that's hidden in all the pasta jars and stuff, right? Or the sauce cans, sauce jars. So it just seems really different, I guess, is like, it's a very long-winded way of saying this seems very different to me as a relationship.
Yeah, and I mean, since we're talking about family, I wanted to jump there, and then I'll backtrack to some of the other things I wanted to talk to, because the concept of family here is really interesting, right? Like, it starts out with the similar dysfunction as Succession, right? Like when we're kind of going back in the flashbacks for Carmi, the dinner table, all that was so intense. A lot of unspoken pain, a lot of resentment, obviously tragedy. There's so many different things at play. Both family businesses, right? But so different. And we've been comparing Kendall and Carmi just a little bit just as of now. But like, one thing that strikes me in what you're saying, Suzanne, is that, you know, there's an isolation with Carmi, but then he comes back, reconnects to Chicago, to the family, but then he like creates this own family in this restaurant, right? Like, that's who I mean, and of course, you know, you've got Richie there, who's actually a member of his family, but like, and his sister and all that.
Actually not. They call him cousin, but no, this is the funny thing. He's not actually related to them. Yeah. No, it's okay. I Googled this, right? And like, I Googled it. They just call him cousin, but he's actually not a cousin. So, but it's that way that like, right, like friends become family. And to your point though.
Oh, snap. Okay. And so it's like, you know, one thing that strikes me is like the relationship between, you know, Carmi and Richie. There is it feels like there's that relationship that's kind of married in Succession a little bit. And like, but they handle it way differently because the bear, as Ramoy, you were saying, right, is kind of like in the middle of that shrinking and a Succession sort of spectrum. And so I just wonder if you guys see like or I guess you see kind of like a bit of a parallel between Kendall and Roman and Richie and Carmi with a very different outcome.
I think for me, the class elements make it a very different story, right? Like, I'm thinking of, again, that season 1 part where basically Richie is saying to Sid, like, you know, we're not, like, the people we serve are like the firefighters and the teachers, and like, this is who we are. Right? Like, this is who we are. And you want to turn this restaurant into something that is not for people like us or like me, essentially. And, you know, Richie is so struggling with a sense of purpose, right? Like, what in the very beginning of season 2, he's like, what's my purpose? Like, why am I here? And I feel like it's strange, but in the Roy family, I mean, again, the sense of purpose is kind of stupid, right? Like, they all want to sort of take over for their father. But I actually think that the men, particularly the men and the bear, are struggling with a more existential, like, question of purpose, right? Sort of like, does Richie belong at a high end, right? Like, at this high end restaurant, and Carmi, from these super working class roots, right? Like, kind of escapes into fine dining, you know, as a way to kind of like, I think of like anxiety or grief as things that that also kind of get marshaled into one thing, right? So Carmi has essentially taken this, you know, really dysfunctional, traumatic childhood and targeted it into like, I'm going to be this chef, right? I am going to like make beautiful food. I'm going to make perfect food as a way of sort of doing something right, you know? And Richie hasn't figured out like what the thing is, right? Like, and I think, I mean, I'm just going to put this together now, but if you think about Marcus and those donuts, right? And he's like, I gotta make the perfect donut. So like, food becomes the place that you know, and you know, we know he has like a, you know, sick mother who's, you know, essentially lived longer than she was expected to. You know, it looks like, you know, she's basically, you know, somewhat comatose, but like that way in which you can find in food some control and some peace and some sense of like, okay, I'm doing something. I am making something. Right. And I think that's really different than the Roys, where essentially what they are doing, like what they're making is so ineffable, right? It's like news.
Yeah. And like, I feel like that brings us to a conversation around like workplace, right? Like to the, you know, like obviously Carmi is taking over this restaurant that he's inherited. You know, all of Succession is work. They're never not working. As a family, they work. Everything is work. So actually, Remo, I want to turn to you about this. Like, how would you describe the work environment in The Bear when the show first starts?
Yeah, so testing my memory here, old man, it's fine. So this is like the original Beef, and it's like messy and I wouldn't say toxic, but like rough at times and displaying some, typical like hyper masculinity and the jokes and the bits and the aggressive nature between some of the staff that are working there, predominantly the men. It is supportive, especially when we get into flashbacks from when Mikey, the older brother, is running it. Like he's a very supportive, loving boss, but in very kind of masculine ways. And so I think that's correct how like kind of the original Beef is run, like, again, very kind of aggressive, bro-y at times, but at times supportive and loving. And then as the show progresses and Carmy takes over, he installs like more of that kind of aggressive masculinity through the fine dining, but also is trying to reinvent it by being a very supportive, like caring, masculine figure. So it's always in flux a little bit, push and pull with the old and the new when it comes to gender, especially.
Yeah. So I love how you put that, because it's like it's not necessarily that like, Carmy doesn't retain any of that like militaristic like chef training, right? Like he comes in, everybody's saying yes, chef. But what I love about the way that Carmy does it is that everybody's saying yes, chef to each other. Right. He creates this like new environment where everybody takes on ownership. And like one of the things that strikes me about the way that The Bear starts, or like the way that it starts out at the original Beef, and then, how it transitions over into The Bear and everybody's relationships, that there are fights every day. Everybody's pissed. There are things falling off the shelves. Everybody's annoyed. I mean, it's just like the most stressful kind of toxic work environment. Like if I were working at that work environment and I went to happy hour with my friends after, I would be like, it's fucking toxic working there. I hate it. Right. But then eventually Carmy deals with his shit. He evolves. And I think that one thing that happens that really makes a difference is also Sid coming to work there, because she has the chef level, they're similar. Well, maybe not similar, but she wants to learn from him as a chef, and she comes in and she's serious, but she also kind of has like the people skills to be able to navigate things with different people. And sure, she has these issues with some folks, including, Lisa Colon, who is, Zayas, who is also nominated, for a SAG award, but she really, I feel, kind of anchors Carmy to be able to like manage that chef life with like the boss life with the community life. And that's the thing for me that stands out here, because, as we know, I love mixed gender leadership, right? I wanted them to like get together because I'm a hopeless romantic. That doesn't happen. And I feel like in a way it's better. And I want to ask you, Suzanne, because I know that you've talked about relationships, like in powerful spaces, for lack of a better word, right? Like workplaces, business places, places where people are making money. So, wanted to ask you about kind of, this mixed gender kind of leadership with Carmy and Sid, and how the fact that they don't become romantic may end up helping like everybody's evolution, not just theirs.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's funny because I would consider myself a romantic too, but I wasn't hoping for that, precisely because I was like, this really is business, right? And it's only like I've been kind of binging the show in preparation in some ways for this, in preparation for this interview. So I feel like this stuff is all super fresh. But like the episode where she like gives the risotto to the food critic, and then they get this write up, right? And then this is all in season 1, where essentially like Carmy completely melts down. Remember, he is a complete meltdown. And then she accidentally like stabs Richie, but like watching her sort of stress level escalate, right? To the point where she eventually like walks out. I think it was really interesting because she is so like his calm, like, or not his calm, but she's so calm. She's so professional, right? And he is just like off the wall, right? And like, and the way in which sort of, I actually showed that episode to my students, because it's all filmed in one take, which is really interesting, right? It's like 18 minutes. It's all one shot, that particular episode, which is just fascinating, like from a cinematographic point of view. But point being, my students were pointing something out, which I thought was really fascinating, which was the men were allowed to be like off the wall from the start, right? Like, you know, Richie's kind of in her face about like giving the risotto to the critic. And that's when they have this conversation where he's like, you're going to turn this into a place that firefighters can't come. And she's like, you know, your firefighters buy like one sandwich, split it and have a glass of water, right? So like, we can't make money off this, but she's like very rational, right? Like about this being a business. And I think that is so important. There's so many ways in which her character is so important to that show, which is, you know, not just that she's a woman, but she's a woman of color, right? But the way in which she is not allowed to have certain emotions that the white men in the show are allowed to have, right? But the way in which, like you're saying, like, he gets better, right? Like in some ways she is supposedly like learning from him, but really she is teaching him how to like be a professional, right? Like be like an empathic leader, right? So I think your point there about, you know, their sort of co-leadership is really important. And as I was saying, I think, you know, I think in some ways, again, because we tend to celebrate I'm thinking about we're celebrating the genius of like, you know, Jeremy Strong and his method acting, whatever. And what is it? Jeremy Allen White, I think is Carmi, right?
Yeah.
But is Sid nominated for any awards? I wanted to ask. Okay.
Yeah. And she won like, I think an Emmy or something
good.
Last year.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, it's like that show seems to be so much about masculinity, but I think it's also like about how the women aren't sort of allowed some of that like extreme emotion. Right? Like if you think of that Sugar and how she comes in and is right.
Oh my God, that's right.
So again, this is not a point I came up with on my own, but my students really sort of made me aware that like basically you can sort of spotlight the men and their trauma and their grief because you have these women who like are kind of keeping it together. Right? Like Tina's kind of keeping it together. Sid is generally keeping it together. Sugar's keeping it together. Right? And I think it's really interesting to me.
Yeah. Tina displays a very controlled anger, which I love. And which we'll get to it in the deep dive. But yeah, I know, Vermoy, I'd love to get your thoughts on this if you know, yeah.
Yeah, I think unfortunately got a dip soon, but yeah, I think it's a good question for me to leave off on because I like Samantha, love like cross-gender relationships. And I too am a hopeless romantic. But like Suzanne, I didn't know if I needed them to like have any romance because there's such mutual respect and support and care given at times between the two. And even when it's not met, like that there is the confidence and the space to like for Sid or Io to kind of like communicate like their frustrations or what they need. And it's such interesting modeling that we don't usually see, and that's cool to see. And like it's the success of this show in certain ways, and how Landgraf at FX kind of creates these type of shows or creates the spaces for these type of shows that show gender in really interesting ways and relationships between genders in really interesting ways. Because I think what Suzanne is right, like it models like how, or maybe it's Suzanne's students, well, it's Suzanne, it models how like what our podcast is trying to communicate and get at the core of is like how the models of masculinity do allow like Richie and Maddie Matheson. That's who I was trying to say earlier. Maddie Matheson, like the facts like to be like wild and crazy and absurd and dumb and idiots and crying and laughing and trying to blow things up. Yes. You being haunted, like they're nuts. And they're allowed to be, but Io shows a little bit, Sid shows a little bit of emotion, and you know it's kind of questioned and it gets challenged and whatever. And so like it's us being able to hold that space that this show kind of shows us in so many interesting ways about gender and masculinity, things of that nature. I'm done talking. I got to go. I'll let you two take it from here.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you,
nice
Ramon.
to meet you, Suzanne.
Thanks. Yeah, you too.
Okay, and we're back. We are here with Dr. Suzanne Leonard from Simmons University. So in this segment, this is where we get deeper, right? I'm going to be asking you 5 questions. And Suzanne, we're going to get a little bit more into your work and some of the concepts and thoughts that came up during the stories. This is called our 5 question segment, but sometimes there might be some sub-questions. So, sometimes we get a little deeper with those. So, so does that sound good? Awesome. So basically, once we've gone through the 5 questions, we'll flip it onto you. You'll get to ask me any question that you like. In the past, we've had questions like, if I could have dinner with anyone who's deceased, who would it be? What made us start the show? And how do you negotiate the tension of watching media that you love but may be problematic, which was a great question. So there are a lot of options. So we are going to dive right in. So my first question is, I know that your research focuses a lot on relationships and marriage within media and pop culture, right? I know you do a lot of other things, but I know you do a lot of that. So we can't have patriarchy without patriarchs. So what have you seen in your work about the type of masculinity that we appreciate so much in pop culture?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, sort of being asked to come on this podcast, because as I was kind of alluding to earlier, I tend to think a lot about kind of women's roles and like how patriarchy kind of affects women. But you're absolutely right. But I've started to really think that patriarchy is really about power, right? And I think where the place I've really started landing is that power is concentrated, frankly, not just in men, but in people with wealth, right? Or white people, right? And so I think even the concept of patriarchy, I think, leaves a lot out, because people think, well, okay, if we could just get rid of patriarchy, then the world would be equal, right? Then we would have a more sort of just world. And what I think is that it's a lot harder, because what we really need to do is sort of get rid of power being concentrated in the hands of certain people. Now, those hands, as we've been talking about a lot today, are usually rich white men, right? So those two things tend to go hand in hand. But I think the whiteness, right, sort of the whiteness of power and the class aspects of power, right, are as if not, are as important as I think the gender, as gender, right? And I think that's where my work and my thinking has really arrived at.
I would 100% agree with that. Like, I feel in some ways, which we've talked about on the show a little bit, and that's one thing that, we still want to do, is have a really deep dive on class, because I think that in a lot of ways, gender is a tool to maintain class separations and different like hierarchies that have existed, right? Like, we think about even capitalism, like historically, like the notion of marriage was created so that people could preserve their property. So it's like, a lot of it, and like a lot of the isms that we deal with are essentially so that people can preserve and accrue wealth. And so, but that being said, in the vein of people using the isms and different societal structures to preserve their wealth, I feel like there was a lot of talk about family values leading up to the election, right? And like this episode, talking about succession, talking about all of these things, right? Obviously, we're talking about these billionaire patriarchs that are running big parts of our lives, right? Like our media, our country, our resources, think about the Koch brothers. Like, it feels like in some ways, like family is usually referred to as a way to keep patriarchs grounded and focused. But what about family structures sustaining power, right? Like, a lot of billionaires, even if the whole family isn't necessarily part of the family business actively, they tend to kind of indirectly contribute to supporting this all-powerful patriarch, this all-powerful masculinity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the it is a giant fallacy to think that family is some haven in a heartless world kind of thing, right? And there was this 19th century theory of family as, or women in the home. It was like they were called the angels in the house, right? Again, white women, right? But they were responsible for sort of the moral instruction of the children, but also sort of keeping the husband grounded. And again, this is all based, again, I should say, on like a heterosexual family too, which is another problem, of course, with masculinity and the sort of assumed heterosexuality of it all.
Yeah.
But the idea that family somehow is some sort of escape from the kind of capitalist idea of everyone as an economic unit, right? To quote Logan Roy here, is a total fallacy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. It's a lie. It's a lie.
Right, exactly. It's a total lie, right? It's a total lie. So I think it's really this misnomer. I mean, to say that, because Vance is married, I mean, that whole thing fascinates me because his wife actually is quite smart and actually has a career and whatever, more than just being some sort of showpiece, as most of the Trump women are. But I don't buy it at all. Right. Like, I don't buy that family makes, having a good family life makes somebody a better person, or having a family makes somebody a better person, or that it becomes anything that can, I think family, if anything, just continues to reinforce these kind of toxic neoliberal capitalist values.
Totally. And I just co-sign that so much because I feel like, one of the things that, we've been talking about is labor, right? And what it looks like to have, what labor looks like in a household. And the fact that we have so many people out there, during COVID who, I keep on bringing this up. I brought this up on the show so many times because it was so intense to see both, a man and a woman working at home and the woman still taking on all of this extra work and the man being like, well, I'm at work. Okay, well, so am I. And we're actually both here at work, but somehow I'm still doing 21 to 28% more work than you are. And so I feel like, to your point, the family really just allows a man, in a way, to continue to pursue those capitalistic gains, right? By being able to manage all the other labor that he doesn't have to take care of, right? Like, he's got, it's almost like the family, in a way, is being run like a business, the way that Logan Roy would. Yeah. And so on that, note, I loved your article, Filthy Fortune and the Wives of Me Too. So I'd love for you to tell the audience a little bit about this article.
So it started because obviously I've been very interested in marriage, but I was really interested in sort of the wives of men who essentially were accused of sexual harassment in one way, shape, or form. And a lot of wives stayed. Frankly, like a lot of wives, like Melania Trump, for instance, one example. But I talk a lot in that article about sort of Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, and and what essentially my argument here is that assuming that women are sort of victims and kind of unable to see what's really happening, or they're dupes, or they're stupid, I think is really not understanding that a lot of these women, who are also, for the most part, like rich, white, and powerful, gain a lot of benefits from these marriages, right? And so to kind of take us right back to this kind of economic argument, right? My second book is called Wife Inc., The Business of Marriage in the 21st Century. And essentially, it's arguing that we need to understand that wifedom is a commodifiable, right? Like a commodifiable role, right? And in those cases of many of those women, they're not dumb, right? Why do you think Melania stays with Trump? It's not because she loves him, right? Like, that is obvious, right? It is because of a closeness and like a benefit from power, right? And so I think, again, to think that this is just about gender and women are the weaker sex or whatever you want to call it, like, I don't buy that at all.
I mean, like I said before we started recording, for some reason, it just had not, like, I never had put it in those terms. And I love the way you put that, like, that this notion of a power couple extends beyond a woman who is, you know, has her own fashion line and then the husband is doing whatever. Like, it can also just be like first lady can also be there just for the notion that like her career can be this public figure, right? She can have proximity to power. She can have proximity to cultural capital even, right? Like be around the coolest people, the richest people, all of these things. One thing that I, found fascinating is like when you're talking about Harvey Weinstein making celebrities wear his wife's fashion line on the red carpet. I mean, that is wild. And I feel like that is particularly, and also Anthony Weiner's ex-wife, right? Being the aide to Hillary Clinton. So it's like these things that we think are just like the doting wife who's just being supportive of her husband, who's this powerful figure, blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's not really what's going on, right? And it's like, that's not what's happening. Like they have a stake for their own selves, which completely trumps this patriarchal notion of what a wife should be.
Right. I mean, just one tiny example. I have a 10-year-old daughter and we've been watching Project Runway, like from the beginning. So we started in like 2006 or whatever that show started. And, okay, Harvey Weinstein's a producer on that show. And his wife, or now ex-wife, basically was a judge on, and so there it is, like her designer. I can't remember what her first name is, but like it's all a pace, right? Like, so exactly. I think that this is all very calculated, right? This is a calculus, and it's a capitalistic calculus, essentially.
Yeah. And I love that because it's like the fallacy, the lie, it's like all fits into this sort of kind of propaganda around what family and marriage really is, right? For capitalistic gain, which we've seen all over everywhere. And now we're in this we're in this political moment that continues to further that on every level, right? Using race, using immigration, using education, using all of these things. So, but I want to pivot a little bit because, we talked a little bit, we kind of touched on this during the stories, but one thing that has come up is you've written a lot about race, and it seems to me like the way that the bear is kind of a character in The Bear, right, at the restaurant, like whiteness and class were kind of like the unspoken characters of Succession. Did you feel that way?
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely did. And I really loved Ramoy's point about how, like, in a sense, the restaurant is a character. Right. I thought that was super smart. I think, though, the thing I would say about Succession and to some extent White Lotus too is that power tends to be invisible, right? Whiteness is invisible, right? I mean that, if you think about like the the Invisible Knapsack, that like really famous essay by Peggy McIntosh. It's all about white privilege, right? And it's kind of essentially like, white privilege is being able to buy a Band-Aid that's skin colored that actually looks like your skin, right? And it's just stuff like that. It's like going into a grocery store, or going into a store and not being followed, right? It's just like all of the things that come with being white that you don't notice because they're invisible to you, right? You don't notice that you're not being watched because you're just not being watched, right? And I think that particularly race even more so than class, because it's obvious that they're filthy rich, right? And we're kind of like, well, of course they're filthy rich, then they must be white, right? We don't even sort of think about that, right? And believe me, if like the Roys were a family of color, that would be the story, right? Like, how did they get so rich and blah, 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 blah. But like, it's unquestioned. And that's what I'm saying about sort of the invisibility, particularly of race. Again, people assume white people will be rich, right? And white people assume they should be rich, which brings me right back to why like people vote for Trump, because it's like, oh, well, like why white people vote for Trump? Like, I'm white, I should be rich like Trump is. Trump says he's going to make me rich, or I'll be rich just like Trump is rich, and I deserve to be rich because I'm white, right? And like, I know maybe people aren't thinking it in exactly those terms, but that essentially is the like logic, I think.
Totally. And yeah, so like, you know, I know that you are, it was great to have you on the show because I feel like your perspective talking about feminism and women, you have a specific vantage point into masculinity and the mask of masculinity, right? And so I'm wondering, you know, what is the function that whiteness has in patriarchy, specifically the patriarchy that we're living in?
My God, I think it's everything.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but I think that's the thing. Again, and this has like been a problem for feminism. Like, well, I think for any social movement is like, on what basis do you sort of form a collective, right? Because you kind of need a collective to have power. And I think the problem that, frankly, a lot of mistakes that a lot of like feminism has made sort of through the ages is assuming a certain gender solidarity without accounting for, right, like all these other kinds of differences. But I think that when we think again about patriarchy and masculinity, when we think of it in terms of the power, we're really talking, I mean, I hate to use this term, but we're actually just talking about white power. Right. And white power tends to reside with men. Right. But there are a lot of powerful and rich white women, too. Right. So in a way, I think that's a simple answer, but I really feel like that is the answer.
Yeah, I love that you said that because, you know, the other thing that's come up a lot in terms of like women acquiring more power and more capital is this notion that a lot of times that requires brushing elbows or kind of even espousing their own sort of like patriarchal power, even as women, right? And that, of course, is that white power, espousing that white power, or at least being adjacent to it, right? And so I love that you make that point, and I think I agree that it's simple, and I also agree that that's what it is. So, really great. Yeah. So, well, now it's your turn to ask me a question.
Ooh, okay. I do have one. Is there a show or something you've had to read or watch for this podcast that you just hated?
Oh my God, what a good question.
Thanks.
Wow. I wouldn't say that there's a show that I had to watch that I hated necessarily, but there has been some music that I no longer really particularly like aligned with that I had to listen to. So for example, we did this episode on glam rock. Mm-hmm. And like, it wasn't necessarily that the music was bad. It was just everything that it represented, right? Because once I learned kind of like that glam rock was being co-opted from like basically the way that glam rock musicians chose to, you know, dress and present themselves, that was kind of co-opted from the LGBTQ community in ways, but then they were also rejecting the LGBTQ community. For me, that really colored the music. And so I feel like one thing, you know, one of the other questions is like being able to deal with media and like, yeah, being able to deal with media that is problematic that I love. Like, I feel like on the other hand, it was more kind of like, I love the media, but the person who's doing it is a problem for me. Like, I am not the type of person who's able to like separate the artist from the music. Have never been able to do it. And then, you know, what happens is like, I wish I were better at this. Like I were better at watching things that I don't like for this show, but I don't. I'm just like, I'm not watching it. Like, I know too much. So yeah, but that's an excellent question. Thank you. Yeah. What about you?
Oh boy. You know, it's really funny because like Bell Hooks has this essay about, she's talking about sort of being a Black woman spectator of kind of like movies that, you know, again, tend to portray people of color in terrible ways. And she talked about how the way she can watch these things is like through kind of, she calls it the oppositional gaze, but it's kind of watching it through this lens of like critiquing and analyzing, right? And so I think it's funny because what I do, because I teach like novels and television and cinema, is like I have to watch a lot of stuff so that I can teach it. And if I can teach it, or if I have something smart to say about it, I like it, even if I don't like it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I like that process of analysis. But then I have these things that I read like purely for pleasure, like, mystery novels or, just stuff that I like just read for fun. So for me, like, they're both pleasurable, but they're very different types of pleasure. There's like the analytical pleasure, and then there's just like the escapism pleasure. And again, they're different.
Yeah. And, on that note, like, I think that Succession was that show for me of like, it's so grotesquely like, it's just so grotesque, like in the power and like the gender, like all of it. Like I was cringing as I was watching it, but the voyeur in me couldn't stop. Like it was just like, so yeah, I totally get what you mean by that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. Like your insights have been great. Loved having you on the show. Would love for you to share where the people can find you, and if you have anything coming up that you want us to plug.
Oh, sure. So you can find me at on Simmons' website, Suzanne Leonard. I am a professor of race, gender, and sexuality studies. And I am actually working on a book called A Feminist Guide to Marriage that will be published probably in 2026. I am still writing it, but I have a contract for it with Goldsmiths Press. And so, yes, so that's what I'm working on.
Well done. Thank you for putting that out. I literally just got married this August, so I will be picking up that book.
Congratulations!
Thank you. Yeah, that's like, great. I love all this research on marriage that like our four mothers never had. So like, I really appreciate the work on that.
It's kind of funny, maybe absurd. You're always bringing up these award shows that neither of us watch.
Maybe it might be absurd. I didn't even watch the Grammys like a couple weeks ago, and that's the only one I actually would watch. I actually wished I had watched it. It was a wild weekend. That weekend was wild in general for so many reasons.
Like, I hate Texas, but I found myself over the weekend especially on a Saturday night into a Sunday morning, I believe, like 12 a.m., I started receiving W2EF texts and exclamation point texts. And I was like, what is happening? And then I was like, no, somebody got hacked. That can't be true. And then throughout the rest of like the late mornings into the early mornings, I was like starting to console my Dallas Maverick friends who were like, Luka got traded to the Lakers. And I was like, I hate the Lakers. I hate the Mavs. I hate the Lakers more. I'm going to console these Dallas fans. Look at that loving, caring, supportive masculinity, even for my enemies. What up?
Actually, yes. That shows what? Growth. Good job, Ramoy. Luka going to the Lakers was unexpected, to say literally the least about it. And then Kendrick also cleaned up at the Grammys. Like, did you follow the beef when it was happening?
Nope.
Somebody had to call out Drake publicly and thoroughly for kissing and texting teenagers. And I'm glad it was my fave. Love me some Kendrick.
Yeah, gross. Just leave it at that, gross.
Yeah, exactly. And if you have any feelings about it, we'd still love to hear about it. We're at masculinitypodcast@gmail.com. And you can hit us up on our website as well, masculinitypod.com.
Yeah, thanks for listening to this bonus episode. We're now really going to go back on break. But before we do, if you enjoyed this conversation, tell a friend.
Tell a friend, tell a stranger, and we'll see you in a few months.
Till then, it's your boy, Ramoy George Philip the First.
And I'm Samantha Nzesi Kifle. Thank you so much for listening.
Peace.
Ciao.